The old version of you can't walk into the next chapter. Stop for a second and notice how that lands in your body. Does something tighten or does something exhale? Here's the truth most people miss. If you're tuned to 88.5, you won't hear what's broadcasting on 104.3. It's not about trying harder, grinding more, or collecting another course. It's about turning the dial. Right now, take a breath and imagine your hand on that dial, feeling it click as it moves. That small shift, that's the collapse point. The moment you stop feeding attention to the old channel, your personal reality changes stations. Today, you're going to feel a measurable micro-shift, that calm, alive sensation that signals your system, just let go. You've seen it. People who transform in an instant, while others loop the same patterns despite knowing better, despite all the information. What's the difference? It's not intelligence or willpower. It's understanding how the observer works. Quantum physics made it clear. What you observe and feed with attention becomes your dominant experience. The brain doesn't care if the pattern serves you. It cares if it's familiar. So, the false self, that identity built from old survival strategies, keeps running because you keep giving it airtime. But here's the shift. Letting it die isn't about disappearing. It's about finally taking off clothes that stopped fitting years ago. Think of the caterpillar. To become the butterfly, the old skin has to stay behind. There's no negotiation, or the radio analogy again. You can't listen to two stations at once. You choose. Or the ancient image of new wine in old wineskins. Pour expansion into a rigid container and it bursts. The structure has to match the frequency. This video will guide you through the actual release, not as theory, but as felt experience. You'll feel your body reorganize, your awareness sharpen, and you'll choose consciously the highest timeline available to you right now. The shift isn't coming someday. It's here, in the next breath, if you're ready to turn the dial. There's a curious moment in anyone's life, that instant when they realize they carry within themselves not just one fixed, unchangeable version, but several possibilities waiting to take form. It's as if there were drafts of who they could be, all coexisting at the same time, waiting for attention to choose which one will receive definitive ink. The superposition of versions of the self isn't distant science fiction. It's what happens every morning when someone decides whether they'll repeat the same old pattern or rehearse something different. The quantum field is right there, silent, offering paths. When a person focuses on something specific, they're telling their inner universe, this is what matters now, and the rest naturally loses strength. That's the observer collapse happening in everyday life. Choosing to pay attention to one possibility makes it solidify while the others dissolve into the background. Imagine someone who's always been the helpful person and suddenly realizes they can say no without guilt. The moment they rehearse that no, look at it with presence and repeat the gesture a few times, that new version starts gaining substance. The brain doesn't distinguish between external reality and intense mental rehearsal. It begins preparing the neural pathways for whatever receives repeated awareness. Habit works like a beaten trail in the forest. The more you walk through it, the easier it becomes to travel that path. These trails turn into actual neural superhighways, freeways where thoughts race at high speed without you needing to think. The good news is that neuroplasticity allows you to create new paths whenever you deviate from the automatic route. When someone stops, takes a deep breath and chooses a different response from the one they've always given, they're literally sculpting new circuits. Brain reorganization doesn't require grand feats. It requires conscious repetition of small detours. Eastern traditions have always known this. They just use different words. Maya speaks of the illusion that the self is solid and permanent, as if you were a marble statue. Anatta goes further. It suggests there's no fixed I, only processes in motion, waves of consciousness dancing. This isn't nihilism, it's liberation. If the old self isn't an absolute truth, but rather a set of learned patterns, then it can be unlearned. The feeling of being trapped in a rigid identity begins to soften when you realize all of that was constructed, and what was constructed can be reconstructed. Ego dissolution doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be gentle, like taking off a heavy coat on a sunny day. Here's a quick exercise that shifts perspective. Stop for 10 seconds right now and name the most dominant old role you carry. It could be the controller, the nice one, the self-saboteur, the anxious perfectionist. Say the name quietly or in your mind. Now feel where that role weighs on your body. Tense shoulders, tight chest, locked jaw. Just observe the weight without trying to fix it. This simple awareness already creates a neural gap, a space between you and the pattern. It's in that space where the possibility of choice lives. Most people spend their entire lives believing they are the character they play, without realizing there's a larger stage where other versions await their turn. When you start seeing this, something moves inside, a sacred restlessness that won't let you return to sleep. What's coming ahead will show you the exact signs that this restlessness isn't a problem, but an invitation. And maybe you're already recognizing some of them without knowing what they mean. The signs don't arrive with trumpets or flashing neon lights. They slip into ordinary days, wearing the disguise of restlessness that won't be rationalized away. There's that sacred dissatisfaction, the kind that makes someone stare at their well-organized life and feel a quiet, "this isn't it anymore," rising from somewhere deeper than logic. Then come the synchronicities, numbers repeating on clocks, license plates, receipts, 1111, 333, 555, catching attention like gentle taps on the shoulder. Dreams turn vivid and sticky, lingering through morning coffee with messages that feel urgent even when they make no literal sense. Mentors appear, sometimes as actual people who say exactly what's needed, sometimes as books that fall open to the right page, sometimes as strangers whose offhand comment lands like activation. The dark night of the soul isn't always gothic and dramatic. Sometimes it's just 3 weeks of feeling hollowed out, going through motions while something underground shifts. It's the threshold moment when the old self starts losing its grip, but the authentic self hasn't fully emerged yet. This is the neural gap, that uncomfortable interval between stopping the old pattern and not yet seeing the new one take shape. The default mode network, the brain's autopilot that keeps you running familiar loops, starts glitching. Someone who always said yes finds themselves pausing before answering. Someone who never cried suddenly tears up at commercials. The frequency is changing, but the dial hasn't locked onto the new station yet. What makes this stage so disorienting is the ambivalence that comes with it. Part of you recognizes the old identity is dying and feels relief. Another part grabs harder, terrified of the unknown. The system confuses familiar with safe, so even when the familiar hurts, there's comfort in its predictability. Letting go feels dangerous because the nervous system hasn't yet learned that surrender isn't the same as giving up. It's like standing in a doorway. You can't stay there forever, but stepping through means leaving behind the room you know. The body registers this as threat, even when the mind understands it as transformation. Here's a mini-script for self-observation that helps map where you are. Sit quietly for a moment and ask yourself, what's asking to die in me today? Don't rush the answer. It might be a habit of people-pleasing, a need to appear strong, a story about scarcity, a refusal to rest. Write down whatever surfaces without editing, then ask, what in me is refusing to go along with this death? Again, don't judge, just notice. Maybe it's fear of disappointing someone, loss of identity, uncertainty about who you'd be without that pattern. This twin awareness creates space for the decoherence of old structures and the coherence of something new. The liminal stage feels like betrayal because nothing is solid. The probability wave hasn't collapsed into clear form yet. Multiple timelines seem to flicker simultaneously. One day, there's clarity and trust. The next, doubt floods back. One moment, there's alignment with the highest timeline. The next, contraction pulls you toward old safe ground. This isn't failure, it's the nature of transition. The entanglement between who you were and who you're becoming creates static. Heart rate variability might fluctuate more during this period as the body recalibrates. Meditation becomes less about peace and more about sitting with the chaos of reorganization. If you're here reading this, if these words land with recognition rather than curiosity, you've already crossed the door of the threshold. The fact that you're paying attention to these signs means the shift is underway. Most people sleepwalk past every signal. You stopped and looked. That alone changes everything. What's coming next will show you how to navigate this collapse point without gripping or forcing, how to let the old fall away so completely that the new has room to breathe. And it might be simpler than you think. The collapse point isn't a concept you study. It's a moment you live in your body. It's that instant when the shoulders drop, the breath deepens without effort, and the mind stops running its endless loop of what-if scenarios. Someone close to the author described it once as the moment I stopped holding my breath through life. She'd been gripping control so tightly, managing everyone's emotions, orchestrating outcomes, rehearsing conversations 3 steps ahead, that she didn't realize her jaw had been clenched for months. Then one afternoon, sitting in traffic after another exhausting day of performing competence, she simply exhaled and said out loud to no one, "I can't do this anymore." Not in defeat, but in surrender. The quantum field responded to that allowance, and within that neural gap, something shifted. Here's a simple guided practice that takes about 2 minutes and creates that same opening. Sit comfortably, feet on the ground. Breathe in slowly through your nose for a count of 4, feeling your belly expand. As you breathe out through your mouth for a count of 6, let your shoulders melt downward. Now bring to mind the old pattern, the role, the identity, the control mechanism you've been carrying. Name it quietly, either aloud or inside. I am the one who has to have all the answers, or I am the one who can't show weakness, or whatever yours is. Feel where it sits in your body. Then, on your next exhale, say, "I let go," while consciously relaxing your jaw and opening your hands, palms up. Notice the space that appears, even if it's small. That's the collapse point, the place where the probability wave of the old self loses energy and the frequency of something new can emerge. Metaphors help when the experience feels abstract. Think of it like finally dropping the rope in a tug-of-war you didn't realize you were losing anyway. Or picture yourself carrying a backpack filled with stones, old beliefs, inherited fears, identities you adopted to survive, and one by one, taking them out and leaving them by the roadside. There's also the image of a balloon inflated with the hot air of control. The moment you stop pumping more air in, it naturally deflates, and you're left holding something much lighter. These aren't just poetic images, they reflect what happens in the nervous system when you stop resisting. The default mode network quiets, heart rate variability stabilizes, and creativity starts flowing through circuits that were jammed with defensive patterns. The real power lives in asking better questions. Instead of, "How do I make this work?" try asking, "If I didn't need to protect this identity, what would I do today?" Feel the difference in your chest when you ask that. The first question tightens, the second one opens. Another one that cuts through noise. What would be my next small, brave gesture? Not a grand transformation, not a life overhaul, just the next true move. Maybe it's saying, "I need time to think," instead of instantly agreeing. Maybe it's sitting in silence for 5 minutes instead of scrolling. Maybe it's texting someone, "I've been thinking about our last conversation and I need to be honest," instead of pretending everything's fine. The authentic self doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers through small acts of alignment. A mentor once told the author about tuning a radio in the days before digital stations. You'd turn the dial slowly, passing through static and fragments of voices until suddenly a station came through clear. You didn't create the station, it was already broadcasting. You just positioned yourself to receive it. That's what letting go does. It stops the static of the old frequency so the signal of the highest timeline can come through. The quantum self isn't something you build from scratch. It's something you uncover by removing what's blocking it. Surrender isn't passive. It's the most active thing you can do because it requires releasing the illusion that your white-knuckled grip was ever holding anything together. One woman in a workshop described her collapse point like this. I was washing dishes, hands in warm water, and I just started crying. Not sad crying, releasing crying. I heard myself say, I don't have to be her anymore. And I knew exactly who her was, the version who smiled through resentment, who never asked for help, who made herself small so others could feel big. 3 days later, she had the first boundary conversation she'd avoided for 2 years, and it went better than any scenario she'd rehearsed, because she wasn't performing. She was present. The glitches in reality that followed weren't coincidence. They were coherence. When you shift your inner frequency, the field of infinite possibility rearranges to match. What's coming next will show you what happens in the body when this shift takes root, and why the benefits aren't just emotional. They're measurable, visible, and undeniable. When the system finally relaxes, something measurable happens in the body. The heart and breath start talking to each other in a language that wasn't there before. This is coherence, not some abstract spiritual concept, but a state where your autonomic nervous system stops fighting itself. Think of it like an orchestra where the strings and percussion were playing different songs, and suddenly they sync up. Heart rate variability, the measure of time variation between heartbeats, becomes more stable and adaptive. Instead of your heart racing at the slightest trigger or flatling in exhaustion, it develops rhythm and flexibility. People notice this as feeling less on edge throughout the day, like the background hum of anxiety that was always there, just quiets. The cascade of changes shows up in everyday moments. Sleep stops being that shallow, restless thing where you wake up at 3 a.m. replaying conversations. It deepens, and you actually feel restored in the morning. Focus sharpens, not the jittery, caffeinated kind, but a clean, steady attention that doesn't fracture every 5 minutes. Creativity flows faster because the brain isn't spending all its energy running defensive loops. Someone who couldn't finish a project suddenly finds themselves in flow states, losing track of time. Another person who always felt mentally foggy describes it as the static cleared, and I could finally hear my own thoughts. Indeed, these aren't vague feelings. They're signs that neuroplasticity is actively rewiring circuits, building new neural pathways, while the old superhighways of stress response start growing over from disuse. Here's where epigenetics enters in language anyone can grasp. Your cells are constantly reading the environment and deciding which genes to turn on or off. When your internal environment is flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone that spikes when you're in constant fight or flight, the body interprets that as danger mode and prioritizes survival over growth. But when you shift into a calmer frequency through surrender and presence, the body gets a different signal. It's safe to repair, it's safe to grow, it's safe to let go of old defensive patterns. Your DNA doesn't change, but which instructions it follows does. This is why someone can feel physically different after a real emotional release. Not placebo, but actual biological reorganization happening at the cellular level. The relational benefits might be the most striking because they're so visible to others. There's less reactivity. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and instead of rage flooding your system for the next 20 minutes, you just Let it go and keep driving. Conversations that used to escalate don't anymore because you're not defending an identity. You're just present with what is. Boundaries get clearer without becoming harsh. "I can't take that on right now," comes out calmly instead of with guilt or aggression. One man described it as, "I stopped needing to prove I was right, and suddenly people actually started listening to me." Another woman said, "My teenager told me I seemed lighter, and I realized I'd stopped carrying her mood as if it were my responsibility." These shifts in frequency change the entire energetic field around you. Then there's what people start calling quiet confidence. That inner knowing that doesn't need external validation. It's not arrogance or loud self-promotion, it's the opposite. It's someone who can sit in a meeting and not fill silence with nervous talking. It's being able to say, "I don't know," without feeling diminished. It's making a decision and not spending the next 3 days second-guessing it or polling everyone for reassurance. The authentic self doesn't perform, it simply is. This happens because the collapse of the old identity frees up enormous amounts of energy that was spent maintaining the false self. That energy becomes available for intuition, for trust, for alignment with the highest potential rather than constant damage control. Walk into any room and you can feel the difference between someone operating from contraction and someone rooted in expansion. Contraction smells like hustle from fear, like proving and defending and managing perception. Expansion feels like someone who's done their inner work, not perfect, not without challenges, but no longer at war with themselves. Their presence is steady. They don't drain your energy. They somehow add to it. This isn't mystical. It's the measurable impact of a nervous system that's found its way back to balance, a default mode network that's been upgraded through meditation and awareness, and a quantum field collapse that chose the higher timeline. What's about to come next is the story that shows all of this in real time, raw, personal, and impossible to forget. It was 3 a.m. and the author sat alone in a parked car outside a closed gas station, engine off, streetlight casting that sickly orange glow through the windshield. The previous 8 months had been a cascade, a business partnership that imploded, a relationship that unraveled in slow motion, a parent's health scare that demanded constant vigilance, and beneath it all, the grinding exhaustion of trying to control every variable. Sleep had become shallow and broken. Mornings started with a to-do list that felt like a life sentence. Every conversation was strategic, every decision triple-checked, every emotion managed and repackaged into something presentable. The old self, the one who had all the answers, who held everything together, who never cracked, was running on fumes. But the grip wouldn't loosen. Until that night. Sitting there in the dark, staring at nothing, something just broke open. Not dramatically, not with lightning or revelation, just a tear sliding down, then another, and then a whisper that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "I don't know anymore, and that's okay." The shoulders dropped. The breath, which had been living high and tight in the chest for months, suddenly sank down into the belly. There was warmth spreading through the sternum, not from effort, but from release, like a knot untying itself. The mind, which had been a static-filled radio station of worry and planning, went quiet. Not empty, quiet. In that neural gap, in that moment of complete surrender, the quantum field responded. The old identity, the one built on control and performance, lost its frequency. The collapse point had arrived. The next 72 hours felt like living in a different movie. First, a text message arrived the following morning from someone the author hadn't heard from in 2 years, a former mentor who said, "I've been thinking about you. Let's talk." The conversation opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. Then, an unexpected opportunity. A project offer that aligned perfectly with where the intuition had been quietly pointing for months, but which the old controlling self had dismissed as not strategic enough. And there was a party invitation from an acquaintance, and normally the reflex would have been to decline out of exhaustion, but something whispered go, and that night led to a connection that became one of the most significant collaborations of the next year. These weren't wild coincidences. They were synchronicities, signs that the frequency had shifted and the field of infinite possibility was responding. But the real transformation was internal. 3 days after that car moment, there was a conversation that had been avoided for months, a difficult boundary that needed setting with someone who wouldn't take it well. In the past, this would have been rehearsed 100 times, every word planned, every reaction anticipated, the whole thing drenched in anxiety. But sitting across from that person, something was different. The words came out clear, gentle and firm, not from a script, but from presence. There was no defensiveness, no over-explaining, no softening the truth to manage their feelings, just honesty. And instead of the explosion that was feared, there was respect. Not agreement, but respect. The authentic self had spoken, and it didn't need the other person's permission to exist. The inner landscape changed too. Priorities that had seemed urgent suddenly looked trivial. Things that had been postponed as someday moved to now. Whoa! There was a newfound ability to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix or escape it. Silence stopped feeling like a void that needed filling. The constant hum of not enough, not doing enough, not being enough, not having enough faded into background noise and eventually disappeared. This wasn't toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing, it was alignment. The death of the false self made space for the rebirth of something truer, something that didn't need validation because it was rooted in awareness rather than approval. One moment stands out with crystal clarity. About 2 weeks later, sitting in morning light with coffee, there was this sudden rush of inner peace, not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but the unshakable kind that comes from finally being real. The thought arrived fully formed. The station was always broadcasting. I just had to stop the static and turn the dial. Everything, the losses, the dark night of the soul, the threshold moments, the ego dissolution, had been part of the transformation, the alchemy from nigredo to gold. The old timeline had collapsed. The highest timeline was here, had always been here, just waiting for the surrender moment to activate it. What comes next is how anyone can weave this into daily life without it becoming another thing to perfect or control, and how to keep the channel clear when the old static tries to creep back in. The shift doesn't sustain itself on the memory of one breakthrough moment. It needs daily tending, but not in the exhausting way the old self used to operate. A minimal routine of just 10 minutes can keep the channel clear. 3 minutes of silence where you simply sit and breathe, no guided meditation or fancy technique, just being present with what is. Then 3 minutes of writing, stream of consciousness, asking what am I ready to let go of today, and letting the pen move without editing. It might be a worry, a judgment, a need to be right in an argument, a micro-control habit. Then 3 minutes of one small new gesture, sending that text you've been avoiding, choosing a different route to work, saying no to something that drains you, speaking up in a meeting where you'd normally stay quiet. End with 1 minute of specific gratitude, not generic I'm grateful for my family, but precise appreciation like I'm grateful my friend laughed at my terrible joke yesterday and made me feel seen. This simple practice maintains neuroplasticity and keeps the neural pathways to the authentic self well-traveled. Hygiene of attention becomes crucial because the old patterns don't disappear, they just lose their grip. Micro-triggers can pull you back to the old channel faster than you realize. Scrolling certain social media profiles that stir comparison, staying up late out of habit when your body's asking for rest, saying yes to invitations out of obligation, keeping company with people who only know the old version of you and subtly punish any deviation from it. One person discovered that her morning routine of immediately checking work emails was setting her nervous system to reactive mode before she'd even gotten out of bed. Switching to 10 minutes of silence first changed the entire tone of her days. Another realized that a particular coffee shop, though convenient, was where he'd spent months ruminating over the failed relationship. Choosing a new spot broke the entanglement with that old frequency and gave space for creativity to return. Building alliances makes the difference between a moment of awakening and sustained transformation. Find one friend who can be a mirror, someone who'll gently call out when you're slipping back into old patterns without judgment, just observation. A mentor, formal or informal, who's walked this territory and can normalize the strange parts. A weekly ritual of review, maybe Sunday morning with a journal, asking, where did I choose the new timeline this week? And where did I default to the old? Don't weaponize this into self-criticism. Make it data collection. The default mode network loves to run familiar loops, and these alliances interrupt the automation. One man joined a men's group where vulnerability was the currency, not performance, and said it rewired his entire relationship with strength. A woman found an accountability partner who checked in every Friday with one question: what did you say yes to this week that the old you would have said no to, and vice versa? There's something powerful about a monthly practice of tangible release, what some call desapego pratico, practical letting go. Pick one Saturday and move through your space with awareness. Clothes you haven't worn in a year that represent an old identity. Books you kept out of guilt. Gifts from people you've outgrown. Digital files and photos that anchor you to a timeline you're no longer living. Donate, delete, release. But go deeper. End subscriptions that no longer serve. Cancel plans you committed to from obligation. Close loops on projects that are draining life force without giving anything back. These aren't just objects and commitments, they're micro-contracts with the past. Everyone you release tells the quantum field, I'm making space for what's aligned with the highest potential. One person described cleaning out their closet and finding a blazer they wore to a job that nearly broke them. Donating it felt like a ceremony, a conscious death of that chapter. When this state is sustained, not perfectly but consistently, something starts happening that feels almost supernatural but is completely natural. The sense of oneness, of unity, consciousness begins creeping into ordinary moments. Standing in line at the grocery store and feeling connected to the stranger ahead rather than separate. Witnessing someone's pain without needing to fix it, just holding space with presence. Synchronicities multiply. The right book appears exactly when needed. A conversation overheard in a cafe answers a question you'd been holding. Signs show up not as proof, but as gentle confirmations that you're on the path. The glitches in reality become more frequent. Time moves differently. Intuition gets louder. Decisions that used to take weeks of deliberation become clear in seconds. This isn't magic. It's coherence. It's what happens when the inner frequency stabilizes at a higher vibration and the external world reorganizes to match. The truth is, this is just the beginning. When you learn to hold this state, when surrender becomes a practice rather than a one-time event, when allowance replaces resistance, when presence becomes your default rather than your exception, the field responds with increased intensity. More activation, deeper self-realization, a felt sense of expansion that doesn't need external validation. The next level isn't about doing more. It's about being more of who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. And the next conversation will reveal how to cultivate this expanded awareness with both feet on the ground, how to navigate the intensification without getting lost in it, and how to recognize when you're being called into even deeper layers of transformation. The frequency keeps rising, and those who choose to rise with it discover capabilities and connections they didn't know were possible. Something in you already shifted while you were here. Before you move on, just pause and notice. How does your body feel right now compared to when you started? Is there more space in your chest, a quieter hum in your mind, a softness in your shoulders? That's not imagination. That's reorganization happening in real time. You're standing at a crossroads, and it's clearer now than it's ever been. On one side is the old self that controls out of fear, manages every outcome, performs for approval, and exhausts itself trying to hold a collapsing identity together. On the other is the authentic self that acts from presence, trusts the unfolding, and knows that surrender isn't weakness, it's the ultimate frequency shift. Here's your invitation, and it's simpler than you think. Choose one new gesture today. Not a massive overhaul, not a vision board or 5-year plan, just one small, clear, repeatable action that the old you wouldn't take. Say no where you'd normally say yes. Sit in silence for 5 minutes instead of scrolling. Send the message you've been avoiding. Speak your truth in a conversation where you'd usually perform. That single gesture is the dial turning. That's the collapse point in motion. And tomorrow, choose another. This is how neural pathways rewire, how the quantum field responds, how the highest timeline becomes your lived reality. If this resonated, if something inside you recognized itself in these words, do 2 things. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next, because the conversation deepens from here. Then drop a comment below and tell me, what old role are you letting go of this week? Name it. Writing it down is part of the release. And finally, click the video on your screen now. 7 invisible things spiritually awakened people slowly abandon. It's the perfect next step, guided by the field itself. The frequency keeps rising, and you're already tuned in. Let's keep going.